I'm Janet.
And I'm Roger.
Welcome to the 6th season of the Halfling and Spaceman Journeys in Active Fandom. There's so many fantastic creators out there, and they all have their own wonderful stories about how the journeys got them to be where they are as creators.
We're here to bring you those stories and hopefully entertain and inspire. Today, we're excited to be talking to JC Kang. JC is a fantasy author, perhaps best known for his award-winning The Legends of Tivara series. In addition to being a fantasy writer, he is an acupuncturist, a martial arts instructor, and has been a technical writer. Welcome, JC.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Woohoo! Wait, do we have JC or do we have Jackie Chan on the show?
You want to talk about Jackie Chan? What I have something here really cool. This is a 600-year-old Kanto that was actually on the set of Shanghai Noon with Jackie Chan.
Oh, wow.
Ooh.
Oh, how awesome.
One of the other things you didn't mention, I actually have a sword shop here in Richmond, Virginia.
Oh.
So we're pretty big on social media. We have about almost 500,000 followers. So
yeah, we forgot about the swords.
Oh my goodness.
How
do you forget about the swords?
How do you forget about swords?
I know. That's my bad. I totally apologize for that. Yes, everybody check that out.
It's not like the Tivara series doesn't have something to do with swords.
No.
Just a little.
Just a little.
Just no. Well, I will have to say, getting back to Jackie Chan, I'm a big fan of both Jackie and you. So, so you're in good company.
I'm in good company.
Yeah, but I'm waiting to see JC fight with a ladder.
That would be, he could probably pull it off, I bet.
No, I'd fall off the ladder pretty quickly.
All right, well, JC, let's go ahead and just jumpstart this. Tell us a little bit about yourself and some of your background.
Okay. So I grew up in the South, specifically the capital of the Confederacy, at a time when it wasn't a very diverse culture. And in many ways, I rejected my Asian roots. I mean, you can tell probably that I am not white or black. But, growing up here in Richmond, I felt very disconnected from my culture. The one thing that I did enjoy, this was like the 1980s, and ninjas were the big craze, ninjas and martial arts, and of course, Bruce Lee. And so that was the one thing, if anything, from my particular background that I had any kind of interest in. And that naturally led to Dungeons and Dragons, as most things do. Dungeons and Dragons really was the gateway drug for me, not to demonic rituals or anything like that, or maybe there were, I don't know, but rather into expressing a level of creativity. And so when I was in high school, I started creating my own Dungeons and Dragons campaign. But when you're 14 years old, you don't really have a good view of the world. And so I created this world, and we played Dungeons and Dragons throughout high school. Went to college, lived in Asia for a few years, and after that, I hadn't played Dungeons and Dragons for 10 years or so. Came back home, and my mom was like, "Do something about that Dungeons and Dragons stuff in your house, in the house." And so, I was going through it, and some stuff I was gonna try to sell, and some stuff I was just my own. The stuff I created, I was like, this is definitely created by a 14-year-old boy who doesn't understand how gravity works. But I could, the base concepts of this world are pretty cool. Well, if I do say so myself. And so I was like, I'm 30 years old now. I'm going to recreate this world. And so, over the next 6 days, I recreated a map, like a political system, countries, different cultures. And after having lived in Asia for so long, I really wanted to focus in on that Asian area. And so on the 7th day, I rested, and I realized I wasn't going to play Dungeons and Dragons again. This is sort of a time when Dungeons and Dragons hadn't been, role-playing games in general hadn't seen that revival in popularity. And so, and plus I had 2 young kids, which I really wish I'd introduced them to it. But in any case, I was like, you know what? I'm going to start writing stories in this world.
Awesome.
Very cool. Well, in a related note to your background, what was your actual education in?
So I went to the University of Virginia. I studied foreign affairs, and I will confess I actually majored in French because I had a crush on a French girl my first year.
Oh,
And then
that's
I
a
had
good
a minor
reason.
in Asian studies. Yeah. College was the time that I was a born again Asian. Growing up in Richmond, there were not that many Asians, but once you go to UVA, there are a lot of them from Northern Virginia, and so you sort of see like a different aspect of it. And so all of a sudden, it was not uncool to be Asian there, and so that's where I guess I sort of became Asian again. Was in college.
Harking back to the thing about Dungeons and Dragons, despite the fact that I've played Dungeons and Dragons for what, 45 years now or thereabouts, I have never had an attractive witch try to seduce me into her coven.
Mm.
I have.
Oh, wow. Okay.
No, I haven't actually. I just made that up.
I was about to say this is taking an interesting turn.
No. We meet some interesting folks. So,
Yeah.
That sounds like at the very least a short story you could write. You know.
Maybe.
All right. So,
All right.
oh, it's my turn. Is it? Okay.
He can be taught.
I can be taught. Well, JC has already kind of admitted to being a geek and a nerd growing up because he had this thing for Dungeons and Dragons. So JC,
And Star Wars.
and
Star
Star
Trek.
Wars. Oh,
And like everything that's nerdy now, and that's considered kind of cool nerdy, but back then it was considered to be social outcast material.
so of all the different Star franchises, which is your favorite Star franchise?
Yes.
That's fair.
Fair enough.
That's
You know,
fair.
I'm actually, because I'm watching Andor right now, and the last 3 episodes are gonna drop in about 2 hours. We got to cut this short. I've been watching some of the Star Wars stuff lately, but before that, I was watching Lower Decks. So,
Mhm.
to me, I love both franchises.
It's fair to love them both. It is perfectly fair to love them both.
What
May
else?
the force be with you.
And also with you. Wait, sorry.
We're not Anglican.
Wrong
darling.
response. Wrong
We're
I
not
just they were
response.
going like Episcopalian
Oh.
there.
That was a meme. I saw that on a meme. Anyway, to throw another star out there, what about Stargate? Did you watch Stargate?
I did not watch Stargate. That really, the TV show was out when I was in Asia. Now I watched the
Oh,
first movie. The first movie, I did see that, but the series, like there are some things that are really popular. Doctor Who, Stargate, the new Battlestar Galactica. There are a lot of things that were, that came out when I was living in Asia
Mhm.
before streaming services were available, and
mhm.
also when I was in grad school. And so, yeah, there were a lot of things I missed out on.
Oh, okay. Halfling, over to you.
Well, was writing something that you always wanted to do? Did you always feel like that was something you were going to do? Or, did it come a little later in life?
Well, the Dragonlance Chronicles. I must have read this when I was, what, 13 or 14, and that made me want to write stories.
Mm.
And actually, like I was saying, I had created a Dungeons and Dragons world when I was like 13, 14, and I wrote my first story. The first chapter was pretty much a copy of Dragons of Autumn Twilight, so absolute junk. But at that time, I actually wanted to write, and I told my father that's what I was going to do for a living. And my father, traditional, very traditional Chinese father, he's like, "You're going to starve. You don't even like to read." you know, he's like, "You'll never make a living off of writing." And so, yeah, I didn't necessarily get a lot of support in that regard.
That's not a cultural thing with your father, by the way. I think most fathers probably have that attitude when their son or daughter tells them that they're going to write for a living. It's
Or be an artist.
or be an artist, any
Or
sort
a
of
musician.
creative, endeavor. It's like you're going to starve, so
But
pay the bills.
but that's what I love about now. I mean, because of the internet and because of all these various platforms, it's like you can self-start. You don't have to necessarily go through gatekeepers anymore. So I know so many people who have become successful in artistic endeavors because the internet has allowed them to do that. But my parents didn't grow up with the internet, so they could
Right.
never conceive that this could ever happen.
Right.
Right.
Right. Right. Well, how long did it take you to get your first novel published?
Oh God. So okay, the year was back then. The year was 2010, and so 2010 was when I recreated this world.
Mhm.
And here in Richmond, we had 3 straight weekends of snowstorms, like 12 inches, which is like unheard of. We had 3 straight weekends, and I forgot to mention I am an acupuncturist. That's what I do for a living. And so when it snows in Richmond, everything shuts down. So we were
Mhm.
shut down for 3 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, I have this world here. And I was like, I'm going to start writing. So I wrote my first story, about 120,000 words in 3 weeks because I was really motivated to do it. Now, I came from a technical writing background. I did like grant writing, and I did technical writing, stock market analysis, all kinds of things where I was having to do a lot of writing. And so the basic rules I knew, but fiction writing is a completely different beast.
Mhm.
And so what ended up
Definitely.
happening, yeah, definitely. What ended up happening is I had this book that was very technical, and I didn't realize it at the time. And in 2014, I just sort of put it to the side. And in 2014, there was the NaNoWriMo. I first heard about it. I met somebody, and she introduced me to this website called Critique Circle. And I took one scene from that book and posted it there, expecting people to rave about how amazing it was. And instead, it was just like, "Oh my God, you do this," and like, "Oh my God, you don't realize what you don't know until people start to point it out." And a lesser man would have given up. But no, I actually took it as a challenge. I kind of one of those people, like I say, my father told me I could never do something. If I would, I was stubborn enough to try to see if I really could. And I had many injuries because of that, by the way. But from a writing perspective, I decided I was going to try to learn how to write a story. And so my first book was actually the third book in my series. It ended up becoming the third book in my series. And in fact, that one short story that I submitted was eventually published in Deep Magic magazine, Jeff Wheeler's magazine. Um, so I wrote this book I should say, I revised it and started building upon it in around 2014. Then my critique partners were saying, I allude to a lot of the main character's past events, and they really feel like they wanted to know what those were before they got into that book. So I wrote a prequel to that book. And when I was done with that prequel, I submitted it to agents. And so put a lot of query letters. I actually got a few people. I don't know. You never know if the agents actually read your book or not. But the feedback I got while I was writing the third book in the series, was that the chapter prologue and chapter one could be a story in themselves. So I actually got feedback from agents. It's like, come back when you do this. Like, okay.
Mhm.
And so it was another NaNoWriMo time, and I pumped out a book one in basically a month. I actually finished what became book four, the last quarter of that, and then what became book one, I finished the rough draft all within a month because I was like really motivated at the time. And so, I let it, I went, got it critiqued. But then in 2015, I was having some health problems, and I was like, I guess I have a flair for the melodrama. And I was here thinking, if you go the traditional route, it's going to take you, you know, two years to actually, see it, the publication. It's like, I have 4 books. I might not even live for another 2 years.
Mm.
So I went the self-publishing route, and in 2017 released the books.
That is,
That's the very long answer to your very short question.
well, talking about your books, we just finished up not long ago the Dragon Song saga.
Hmm. That was the
And
series I was talking about.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So in the development of the Dragon Song saga and and your overall world, did your interest in Chinese medicine and the other business with the swords wrap up into that and kind of neatly into a bundle?
So, I had spent 4 years in Asia, and I was hooked on like Japanese dramas, especially the samurai dramas. I loved kung fu movies. And at the time there wasn't a lot out there. And so I actually had this idea I was going to write 3 books, one in the Western world, one in the Asian world, and then one thing to bring it all together. This is what I envisioned at first. And so at the time, since there was nothing really that much Asian out there, I was like, that was the first book I was going to write. And so at the time, I was already an acupuncturist. I had already been practicing for a while. I did not have a sword story yet, but I did have many years of martial arts at the same time, and so I think that really went into that first series, the martial arts side of things, and actually the Chinese philosophy as well.
Now, do you actually teach martial arts? Are you an
I do.
instructor?
I do. I if you've seen the movie, have you seen the movie Ip Man? IP Man?
I
Oh,
don't think we have.
no.
Okay. So
I,
Ip Man, this is a movie. It came out in 2008. It's about Bruce Lee's teacher, and he was like a master of the Wing Chun Kung Fu system.
uh-huh.
And that was something that I had wanted to learn for a really long time. And then when I was living in Taiwan, I actually found a teacher and started learning from him. And it turns out he was Ip Man's nephew. So, not that that means anything, but I started training. And when I got back to the United States, I started teaching. In
Awesome.
fact, my father kept on saying, it's like when I was living in Taiwan, he's like, you need to come back to the US. You need to really start on with your career and stop goofing off. And I was like, well, I need to I want to finish learning this Kung Fu system so I can teach it when I'm in acupuncture school. I was total bullshitting. I was like, there's no way this is going to happen. But when I got to acupuncture school, indeed, half of our income came from me teaching Wing Chun. So, yeah.
That's just fascinating. That's
That
absolutely
that that is
fascinating.
that is.
How do we attract such fascinating people that
We're
have these
we're
that
lucky.
have
We're
these
we're lucky.
wonderful backgrounds? It's just
I think if you interview fantasy sci-fi authors, you will find they are a rogues gallery of many interests. So,
we do find that to be the case. Yes, absolutely. That's one of the things that we absolutely enjoy about doing this show is all the wonderful, not just writers, but creators in general that
mhm.
we get to talk to that have just these wonderful backgrounds that are just amazing.
People that are cooler than us.
Absolutely, no doubt.
So, JC, who is the favorite character which is the favorite character you've written of all the characters you've created for your books?
At this point, it would be Jia. You could probably tell that in the stories. That's the half elf spy.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't originally the case. When I wrote my first story, it was supposed to be. I was very much influenced by Horse and His Boy, from the Chronicles of Narnia. This idea that these two people have that someone has to escape from a from a foreign city, and they have to like jump through all these hurdles. And so that was actually the first story I wrote was that. And so it really was about the two other characters, Tien and Kaya. They were originally my favorite, but I think Jia brings out kind of my smart alecness. I was about to say another word, but I know this is supposed to be family friendly. My smart aleck in me, and so I think that comes through in the story when you perceive things through her. There's always some sort of like snark involved or some sort of sarcasm that
Hmm.
she sees something. So she became my favorite character.
Okay. Okay.
And she's in all my books now. I mean, basically, she was also maybe because she became my favorite character. She was also my reader's favorite character, and so in
Hmm.
order to try to connect other series, I put her in all the books so that my readers would continue to follow her story.
And it's worked out well because we thoroughly enjoyed that thread along those books. So nicely done.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
um, well, how would you describe, if you could, and some writers can't really do this, but if you could describe your writing style, how would you describe it?
Do you want the well? Uh, hmm. So I try to write in very close third person perspective. And this is something you will see in George R. R. Martin and Brandon Sanderson's work. And of course, I will never say I'm anywhere close to their level. But what I really like to do is I like the narrative to bring out the character. So, I think some people, when they're like, I write in third person, but try to make it feel like it's in first person. So that's my attempt. I've been told I write similarly to Naomi Novik, which I think is great flattery. But I don't know if I would compare myself to that. But definitely, sort of this idea. I try to get into the head of the character and make the narrative um, that character's well then try to make it the story there. And so just to bring up an example, because I think a lot of people have read Game of Thrones, what I think is really interesting is that if you go and if you're reading a chapter, you don't even have to see whose point of view you're in, but you can just take any random passage and read it and just, maybe no one's even talking, you're just getting an observation, but how that particular character perceives the world around them, you know who it is. And the other thing that you see in Game of Thrones, especially, or Song of Ice and Fire, is that these points of view mature. You have a bunch of children basically who are thrown into the fire, and as they get older and have been exposed to like more traumatic activities, their viewpoint matures. And the same thing, you have Ned, who is the father. His viewpoint is already mature. He's a very dour Northman, and so that really comes through in the way that the narrative goes. And so that's kind of what I aspire to. I aspire for when someone, like, if they knew my characters and they opened to a random page and started reading, even if there was no dialogue, no mention of names, my hope would be that they could say, "Oh, I'm in Jia's point of view. Oh, I'm in Kaya's point of view." Because, like, I don't know if you noticed, but Jia, she emphasizes smells, like what she smells around her. Every chapter starts with what she smells. And with Kaya, it's like
Yes.
every chapter begins with what she's hearing.
Mm-hmm.
And with Ken, it's usually some like long, drawn out philosophical statement on the world, even though he can never verbalize that himself. So
Yeah, it's funny. I couldn't put my finger on it at the time, but yes, now that you have said that, I totally get that, because I think back on, on the books, and yes, I know exactly what you mean when you say that now. So very cool. Very
if
cool.
I succeeded, then that's great. I mean, it's there's some people who do that marvelously, and I consider myself still working at it. So
Uh, well, so in terms of your writing process, do you sit down and like plot out your entire storyline, or do you just sort of kind of let it flow?
yeah. I have tried that. It doesn't work for me. So one of the things, and I think you hear this a lot among authors, and when I first heard it, I thought it was really shallow, like they're just basically trying to show off or whatever. And so this idea that, oh, well, the character wouldn't let me do that, or whatever. And I was like, oh, this sounds so pretentious. But then when you actually start to write, you realize as you get to know these characters more, you're like, you wanted this character to do that, but they're too smart to do that. There's no way they would do that. So you have to figure out a way to force them to do it. Or, if it's an important plot point, you have to figure out a way that they have to do it even if they don't want to, or they have to be tricked into it. So I think the idea of plotting things out like step by step, it'll never go the way you want it to, or at least that's been my experience. I'm much more, write a scene and keep on see where that goes. You have a compass, what direction you want to head in, but you know what the end goal is, but you don't necessarily know how you're going to get there. And there are certain plot points, there are certain things that I say, okay, this needs to happen and this needs to happen, but how we get there, I'm not exactly sure. Whereas that's what we say is, there's such a thing as a plotter, or a pantser. The person who plots around, or someone who flies by the seat of the pants. And then there's the plantsers, the ones who are kind of a mix of in between. I'm much more, if you had like a gradient, I'm much more pantser than plotter, but the plot is there as the sort of the guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
Well, see, Halfling, I'm a plodcaster because I plod along.
Do do do.
Okay,
Okay,
I don't have my symbols, but
well, it's funny. That brings to mind a writer that we had on fairly early in the show, and I was gonna kick out of this story. I'm sorry, but he was talking about how he had this one character, and this character was supposed to go through a 4-book series. Okay, and he started writing book 2, and at some point when he was writing this for this character, the voice in his head said, "This is where I die." And he was like, "What? No, you don't die. You don't die because you're supposed to make it to the 4th book. You can't die here." And he heard this voice saying, "This is where I die." So he had to figure out, okay, if this is what the character is really telling me. I mean, he's not schizophrenic or anything like that. I promise you.
I was wondering, but I wasn't going to say
We know.
anything because
We know the dude. He's not schizophrenic, but
And we've heard similar stories from lots of
yeah,
writers.
he's not the only, but his is the most vivid example of of thinking what what's going to happen, and then all of a sudden finding out that no, that's not going to work, or something better is supposed to happen, or you got to figure out this. And his was, okay, I've got to figure out how this character is going to die, and then what I'm supposed to do with the rest of the rest of the two books, because he's supposed to be in it. Anyway, he said it actually turned out that the other books were better because he did that. He
Mhm.
had the character die. So anyway, I always think that that's kind of an interesting story. Um, but anyway, well, Spaceman, I think it's over to you.
Well, JC, we ask people about their creative journeys, and that's kind of the primary focus of what we do here. So, in your creative journey, what has been the biggest surprise for you so far?
Biggest surprise. I would actually say the biggest surprise has been the supportiveness of other people in the community. It's something where, oftentimes people can be very competitive in various fields, but I think in many creative fields, there is a lot of support. I mean, we're all going through the same thing, and well, more or less. And so it's something where, especially in writing, it's not something that you succeed on your own, especially like my particular books. I think the first year they might have sold 2,000 books the first year,
Hmm.
but then the second year I hooked up with some authors who we were all helping each other, and once we started working together, everything clicked, and that year I think I sold 50,000 books. It was just such a great support structure. And so, yeah, I think that is probably the biggest thing, is that we're not really in competition with each other, especially with readers, because a reader, you can only write a book, but so fast. But if you have friends who write something similar and you think, hey, a person who likes my book will like this person's book as well, then we can help promote each other. So
Hmm.
really, it was the supportiveness, especially having come from some other more cutthroat, uh, jobs in the past.
Well, that makes me ask the question: are you part of writers groups, or have you been?
I have been. In fact, that to me was the joy of writing. I haven't produced a whole lot in the last since COVID, pretty much, and then part of that is because I've been more disconnected from author groups for various reasons. But yeah, when I was very much tied into author groups, I had much more creative energy. It was really great. You feed off of each other's ideas, you feed off each other's enthusiasm, and so, yeah, I really miss that. I'm not as involved as I used to be.
Well, so if that's been kind of the biggest surprise, the amount of support that you have among your peers, what's been the biggest challenge for you, and have you been able to overcome it, and how?
Oh, for me, it's motivation, and that like this is it ties into the same thing. When I guess I'm someone of a validation. I was about to say stop. you know, I, I'm very much I need validation, and I understand that about myself. And so when working with other people and getting feedback, it feeds into it. I really get that the creative juices going. I get more motivated to do something.
Hmm.
And so at times of when there are lulls in that, it's really hard for me to go. Or when, like right now, we're so busy with the sword shop that it's so hard to find time to write. I mean, my best writing time is the same time that my partners in Asia are like we're getting business done. So it's really hard to make that happen like it used to. So that's the hardest part for me is just maintaining motivation.
I personally, I understand that because in my mind, I've come up with something I call the convention paradox. We need to go to conventions to meet people and promote the podcast, but the time I'm at conventions, I'm not working on the podcast. So,
Promoting
it's
your podcast.
exactly. So I'm promoting the podcast and I'm not actually working on it.
It's all part of the same thing. I mean, that also, as much as I say that working with other authors was very motivating. There is also the marketing side of things, and so when you're marketing, you're not writing. So
Mm-hmm.
that was when I was really involved with it. There were times I wouldn't write as much just because we were so busy going through the marketing stage of things. So I get that.
I think you got the next one.
Okay.
he seems to be losing track.
I always lose track, darling. I always.
I'm probably answering a lot of your questions ahead of time because I love the sound of my own voice.
It's okay. It's okay. If we didn't love the sound of our own voice, we would not be doing this.
Doing a
So,
podcast.
doing the podcast. That's right. The podcast. Now, if I launch another new show, it'll be the podcast. But that's a digression. JC, what's the best piece of advice you've gotten from anybody? Well, about any of your creative endeavors, but specifically about your writing.
Specifically about writing. Wow, that's a hard question. I don't know if you set these questions ahead of time. I definitely didn't see this one.
I
The
did.
best. Okay, I was bad. The best piece of advice I would say is not as much about writing as much as it is about marketing one's books, and that
Mm-hmm.
is that the cover art is everything. We say we don't judge a book by the cover, but ultimately we judge the book by the cover. So the cover has to convey the genre really quickly, and it has to stand out, but not stand out so much that people can't tell what it is.
Okay. Okay. And if you could give a piece of advice to upcoming creators, what would it be?
Connect with people who are in the same field, who have, just as I was saying, that I feed off my motivation feeds off other creators. Connect with other creators who are just doing something very similar, because like I said in the beginning, it's like we live in a whole new world where social media helps immensely, and once you start connecting and working with each other, you help to increase each other's platforms and really help to get your name out there.
Okay.
I can definitely see that. Um, well, if you had a time machine, which we all wish we did, but if you had a time machine and you could go back in time to your younger self, what's one thing that you would do differently?
So you're talking about like quantum leapish, where you take your current consciousness and put it in your old body. Oh, another thing I like, quantum leap. Putting your current consciousness in your old body, or is it you meet your younger self and give him advice, or
Whatever
her?
works best for you.
What? But just
What would you do?
pick
No, okay,
one.
I would not skateboard. So, like as I was saying, I at the beginning is that I was so set on not fitting into the Asian stereotype at that time. I did a lot of things that I shouldn't, and I would say skateboarding is one of them. You've met me in person. I'm not a small person. I'm 6 feet, and well, I wasn't as fat back then as I am now. But I just didn't have the body type for skateboarding, and I sprained my ankles so many times, and I think that it's led to a lot of health problems now. Though as I said in 2015, that was part of it. Was like foot and ankle problems, which made me like sort of go through like doomsday scenarios. Yeah, I was being melodramatic.
Hmm.
So yeah, I would tell myself not to skateboard. So
Haven't heard that one before.
That's new.
That is a new one. That is a new one. Well, yeah. That,
I think and this is something I'm in my 50s now, and so I'm in a point where I have a lot of life satisfaction, and I think that everything that both good and bad has brought me here. So I don't know if I'd really want to change anything, honestly. I mean, there are a lot of bad times. There are a lot of good times, and I don't think that you can become the person you are without having to go through all of that.
It was
So maybe instead of actually telling my younger self, or my consciousness occupying my younger self, I would just rather sort of sit back and watch and laugh. Ah!
uh,
Uh,
I've often tried to think of what I would tell myself if I were in that same position, and I can't answer the question. So good on you for being able to answer the question with not skateboarding. That's good
Again
advice.
in 10 years. Ask me again in 10 years. Somebody else.
uh,
JC, are you working on any new books now?
Yes, I need to finish off this series. This is nope, not this one, but this series here. I have two books out, and I need to finish it. I've been working on book three, but it's been slow going. Just I'm so busy with other things,
Okay.
and I am working on a sequel to this collection of novellas. So I haven't actually. I put this aside to work on that one, but I kind of yeah. Those are the two things I'm working on right now.
One of the things we always ask authors, well, most of the time ask authors, is that can you give us the elevator pitch for what you're working on,
For what I'm working on,
or the series you're working on?
oh gosh. No. No, it's too much of a mess. I can give you the elevator pitch for things I've done. I mean, you've seen
That
me in
that's
convention. So,
that's fine. That's fine.
okay,
I,
that I can do. The stuff I'm working on, that's a whole nother story. But this is my main series, the Dragon Song Saga. It's about a misfit with the perfect voice to evoke the lost magic of dragon songs. Only there are no teachers, so she has to cobble it together by observing the other kinds of magic in the world. Book one centers around a lute made from a dragon scale, and only a dragon singer can coax the magic out of it. She has to learn how to do it before her father, the Emperor, marries her off to a sadistic traitor. There's also a spy component where two snarky ninjas have to uncover a plot against the throne. Both threads come together in an explosive ending. It's the start of a four-book complete series. As action adventure, backstabbing, betrayal, a little bit of best friends to enemies, lovers, slow burn romance. Kind of like my life, minus the romance. Minus the action and adventure. It's pretty much just backstabbing and betrayals.
and that pretty well describes the series of books. The books were
yeah,
awesome.
yeah, it
The books,
does.
the books were awesome.
They are. They are. We really enjoyed them. Uh, oh, that's great. Well, I want to go back to the question where Spaceman asked you what your favorite character is, and I want to kind of do a do a little bit of a flip on that. What character would you most like to be
The
of
same
the ones
one.
you've written?
I would love to be Gia. Yeah, she's awesome. She's like
Jeez.
sneaky and yeah, yeah. She's my favorite character. I would love to be her.
The I'm one of the best things about the Dragon Song series was that every fantasy setting has their own version of orcs. And your
Hmm.
orcs, the actual orcs in the Dragon Song series weren't the orcs. The Bovians were the orcs. And that's the thing that
Fun.
I liked.
Yeah, that was I started off with a premise in this series. This idea that well, I don't want to reveal what the premise is, but you have these two human ethnic groups. One claims to be descended from the son of the mortal son of God and of the sun god, and one is the chosen people of that God. And it wasn't meant to be like a Jewish versus Christianity thing at all. Not at all. But it definitely was this idea that you can interpret a religion differently and have enemies because of it, and become like serious like rivals and enemies because of it. And so the Bovians were not meant to. I should say they're. Hmm, the concept of the Bovians is actually genetic in nature. They have they have something on their Y chromosome which makes certain recessive genes express more, which turns them to the way they are. And because of that, when I started with that idea, it just became this whole list of effects that would happen because of that. And so that sort of formed the basis of their culture. So
And then you get into the idea of what traits would they have because of that. You
And
explain that. Yeah.
how that genetic expression impacts their culture. It's very well
Mm-hmm.
thought out.
Oh yeah.
It's very well thought
Yeah.
out.
Yeah. Like I
but
said, we really enjoyed it. Enjoyed
the
the entire
series I'm working
series.
on now really wants to flesh out how their culture is in different places, like the places that they have come and occupied, like places like their homeland, certain customs which we won't go into and are not necessarily great for on screen talk, but how that is carried out in places where it's a custom that's been in place for 200 years versus one where it's just starting. It's just when you try to introduce a new holiday or something, a new custom, it's going to push up against resistance. And then as time goes on, there's a different way people adapt to it a different way. And so that's sort of explored a little bit in this other series I'm working on.
Okay. All right. Well, JC, where can people find out about you and about your books?
Well, you can always go to my website, jckang.dragonstonepress.us. You can follow me on social media. Just look up JC Kang on pretty much like Instagram, Facebook, TikTok. You'll find me there.
Okay. Okay.
Cool. Well, we will get that in the show notes for sure.
Thank you.
Well, I did have another kind of fun question.
As long as it's a fun question.
It is. It's sort of a fun thought question. Okay, you already do some really cool things besides the writing anyway. But I'm going to ask the question: if you couldn't write, what other thing would you do?
Well, I guess I'm already doing that.
That's
Running a
what I
store.
said. That's what I
Yeah.
said.
The dude is a acupuncturist, sword master, martial arts instructor. I mean, the coolness factor is already through the roof, Janet. What do you expect?
I know. Well, I mean, he could have said something like, well, I'd be a CPA. I mean, do you have some hidden desire to be a CPA? No.
Wait, so here's the thing. Have you guys read Trigger Baru Cormoran? Absolutely brilliant book by Seth Dickinson. And the protagonist is basically a forensic accountant. And so I think that if you look at my other series, and to some degree with the Dragon Song Saga, Tien is kind of he has this forensic accountant side of him as well.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it really comes into play.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I don't necessarily know if I would enjoy it as a job, but from a personal perspective, it's been a lot of fun.
Okay, fair enough.
All right, well, Halfling, why don't you bring us on home?
Bring us on home. Okay.
Bring us on home.
All right. Well, actually, we have one other question, which is, what's next for you?
What's next? Well, I am definitely. I want to hit the conventions a little more hard. Both of my kids are in college now, which gives me a lot more free time, and I also feel like pitching. It takes a lot. Like conventions take a lot more out of me now than they did 5 years ago. So I figure I might have 1 or 2 more good years of hitting the conventions and selling books. So that's part of it with the reading and writing, or with the writing aspect of things. Definitely want to finish the series and also do the sequel series to this. So a lot of things that are on the plate right now.
Awesome.
Very good.
Awesome.
Keep them busy. Very good. Well, we want to thank you so much for taking the time to join us. It has been an absolute pleasure. We've had a lot of fun talking to you and hearing about your journey and all the various really cool things that you're doing. And we just hope that you keep at it. And we wish you all future successes. And thank you again.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. It's been a fun time. I'll have to recommend this podcast to everybody.
The Plodcast.
The Plodcast.
The Plodcast. I like that. All right. And we want to thank our audience for tuning in today. And we hope that you've enjoyed and become inspired by today's guest, JC Kang. We want to give you all a huge thank you once again for joining us. And this is the Halfling. This is the Spaceman for the Halfling and the Spaceman podcast. Over and out. The podcast over and out.